Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I recently made a video looking at the best melee medieval weapons that someone who possessed super strength would want to use. What weapons would really suit them the most? The subject is intriguing, it's a lot of fun, and it's actually far more complex than I might have realized in the past, and because of this, there are things that I felt that were just left out that I want to address. There's further discussion we can have on the topic, so I'm making kind of like a part 2, yet you don't really need to watch these videos in any particular order. This one first, next one, but they do go together. So if you haven't watched the previous one, please check it out after you check out this one if you haven't already seen it. So I'm going to answer some of the additional questions and thoughts that kind of arise when looking at what would be the best. And one of the first ones that I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of, do you really even need weapons? In my previous video, I explained that you have limitations in the amount of force that you can produce. Watch the video for the full breakdown and analysis there. What I want to talk about right now is the idea of force multipliers, because that's what weapons are, okay? Now, yes, we can use our body as a weapon, you know, throwing punches and stuff like that. So in that sense, we are a weapon. And of course, this would be increased with super strength, just not nearly as far as we often suppose. Yet even with our own combative abilities with our bodies, we still use weapons. And that is because weapons either extend, increase the force that we can produce, or focus that force on a smaller edge. You see, our fist has a fairly large surface area that all the force that we can produce kind of gets dispersed over. But as soon as we use a weapon, right, not only can we get additional power through linear momentum, the tip of any hafted weapon, or even a sword or anything like that, is moving much faster because of rotation, so we're able to produce more force that way, but that force is focused on a much finer edge. And this also applies with other weapons other than swords. Swords kind of do that the most, but there are limitations for sword, which I want to talk about a bit later. But even things that generally have a wider surface area than swords, like clubs, war hammers, and maces and stuff, they still concentrate a force on a smaller, you know, direct area, and they are far less give than our kind of fleshy, bone-ridden, you know, knuckles and fists and stuff. They're stronger, they're harder, so they're able to hit things and transfer force much more efficiently. So whatever strength we have, whether it's normal or superhuman, the same principle will actually apply. When you use a weapon, you will be able to produce as much force as you were able to before, but focus it on a greater, finer area and get additional increases in that force through many means. And so it really does make a lot of sense for someone with superhuman strength to use a weapon if they want to amplify, maximize the amount of damage and destruction that they can do. So absolutely, weapons and super strength, they definitely go together.
Like peas and carrots.
So the, you know, comments saying there's no point, I disagree. When it comes to Hulk level strength, okay, maybe there's a bit more of an argument there, but even with Hulk levels of strength, there are certain limitations. And the Hulk would still get added advantages, you know, maximizing, increasing the amount of force he can produce with weapons. And so I do think the arguments that I just, you know, made before do apply even with huge amounts of strength. Now, Superman, on the other hand, is different because he has the added advantage of flight, and one of the limitations with super strength is your weight and also your ability to anchor yourself to really employ the strength that you have, because it's not super speed. More on strength versus speed a little bit later. But with Superman's ability to anchor himself with flight, and of course he has super speed as well, Superman doesn't really need weapons because he can move his fist so fast that basically on impact he would atomize you. He could create small nuclear explosions essentially with the insane levels of force he can produce. He can throw his punch at near the speed of light. That's the kinetic energy there is greater than nuclear level, you know, releases of energy and force. It's insane. And it goes a little too far, in my opinion. Which brings us to the next discussion I want to talk about, and that is the relationship between strength and speed. And some people have, you know, brought up saying that they feel the speed increase would be much greater than I was implying in my previous video. And look, I can grant that. In some instances, it's very possibility because you have, you know, fast twitch muscles and slow twitch muscles, and when you are getting an increase in strength, a greater ability for your muscles to do what they're supposed to do, well, if there are fast twitch muscles, that should generally say that your muscles should be able to move even faster if they're superhuman. But again, we're trying to analyze what is this superpower. It is super strength specifically, not super speed. And so if you were to have super speed in a more natural kind of biological format, well then that would make sense that if it was being produced from your body, fast twitch muscles would be the ones being enhanced. weapons. But super strength is specifically your ability to lift things of greater weight, and in that sense, I actually don't feel your fast twitch muscles would be getting a massive boost if strength was the focus of this power. If both was getting enhanced, well then you'd be getting enhancement in strength and speed. And even if the enhancement of strength was so much better, you're still getting enhancement of speed. And in that sense, if speed was a stronger related enhancement with super strength, well then your ability to produce greater forces would be much, much more. And that also translates to the discussion of weapons, because if you can accelerate any part of your body much quicker than before, you should essentially be able to do that with a weapon in hand, which means the force that you can produce with a weapon is again even greater than the force you can produce without. So once again, adding these weapons to our superpowers, strength even with greater speed, increases the force that we can produce much more. Weapons are force multipliers. Another insanely effective weapon that would be so well suited for someone with super strength is actually really, really heavy armor. Several people mentioned this in the comments below, and you're absolutely right, okay? Heavy armor would give some really significant benefits. Why? Well, one, it's huge protection, but if you have super strength, you're not really restricted and hindered nearly as much regarding the armor's weight. So you can make the armor much thicker than regular. Now, regularly you wouldn't be able to move, but with super strength, you could handle it fine. Then you get a really significant property that you didn't have before on top of just protection, and that is weight. Now, people's like, why is weight a protection? I've covered this in one previous video. Also, the problem with giant swords. I mentioned that having greater enhanced mass would actually increase your ability to produce force much more than having enhanced strength. Strength, you'd be able to produce pressure, lifting something up, pulling something apart, pushing at something if you have something to push, on the other side, but not necessarily throwing a standard punch. You see, momentum is a result of both mass and velocity. If you don't increase one of those two things, the forces that you're able to produce in a punch isn't going to be altered that much. But if you can increase either mass or speed, well, my goodness. Now, in regards to super strength, it's not super speed, so you can't really increase that too much, but you can increase mass, and you do that by wearing really heavy armor. And if you were to say wear, 50 kilo armor, maybe even up to 100 kilo armor, oh my goodness, okay, you would be able to produce far more friction in your feet, which will anchor yourself in any punches you do. You have far more weight and momentum to throw into this punch because of this, mass that's now behind you. So your punches would be far, far greater. You have protection, and then you could add things like spikes on your knuckles and stuff like that to focus the force. And again, spikes is really a type of weapon. Focus the force on a much smaller area, your damage potential just skyrockets. And then on top of this, your ability to handle larger, heavier weapons would be increased once again because you have more weight and mass anchoring yourself, which prevent you getting thrown off balance whenever you use the weapon that you have. And depending on the type of super strength, if you can lift a car, okay, that's at least a ton or two, right? This armor isn't going to be slowing you down. In fact, it might not even feel like you're wearing it. It might not slow you down one bit. And so your lethality would just be insane. So really heavy armor is just so potent and, just a massive thing that I had to make a whole video just kind of really emphasizing this point because you guys were right. Armor is just phenomenal for someone with super strength. Heavy armor specifically. I also want to address an interesting problem that would be created with a type of sword, like a giant sword that you were using that had a really big counterweight on the other end. Because like I mentioned in my previous video, having that counterweight would enable you to actually strike with the sword and not topple over because the center of balance is now above your own. But once you accelerate that sword to a certain, speed, slowing that down is going to be quite a problem. You can strike, you stop, but then the sword is going to want to go with you, and that could just, pull you into a spin, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can go with it and use that as a type of fighting style. I talk about this in my video, how to make super giant swords workable using, momentum and an acrobatic kind of fighting style. But there's also a way to fix that, and that is hit the person that you're aiming at. I mean, essentially, you do want the blade to stop from the person, okay? Stopping when it hits the person or just going through when I say person, it's the enemy, the bad guy, okay? You don't want to hit a good guy, it's the bad guy. Oh yeah, absolutely, you do want that. And one of the things that I also want to clarify when I talk about holding the sword and it'll cause you to topple over, I have to kind of readjust that because it's true what I said there, but you're rarely holding it out like that. I mean, in certain stances you are, but with this, sword that has a big counterbalance, you can just hold it in above or up like that. you're fine. And when it comes to holding the sword out here, there is a time when the sword will get like that in downward strikes. But that's not a problem because, yeah, holding it out there will cause you to topple over, but when you're striking downwards, you want the sword to go down anyway. And so massive downward strikes would be perfectly valid. You can extend the sword past your center of balance, and it will stop, okay? You're not going to throw yourself off balance because it's going to stop when it hits the ground or lodge itself fully in the ground by several meters. But if you've got the super strength, you can just lift it out and you're fine. And the other thing about not being able to stop this sword's momentum once you really get it going is that you can just spin it, okay?
I'll try spinning. That's a good trick.
Because absolutely, once you get that sword into a strike, being able to stop it like we do with regular swords, if this sword is got far more mass than your own mass, you don't have the ability to anchor and stop yourself. Again, heavy armor can help out in that regard, as we mentioned before. But one of the things you can do is just keep spinning it like a helicopter of death. I mean, there are certain combat styles that actually do employ spinning. When you look at traditional greatsword treatises, they are spinning around with their swords, okay? And this is kind of area control tactics. Now, with this type of sword, when you throw a strike like this, it is going to pull you and spin you around, but if that's what you want to do, absolutely. So you can do upward spins, you can do full round house spins, and then if you want more control, so, you know, in terms of horizontal control, it might get a bit out if someone walks in and is like, that's not good, but you can spin it on a vertical plane up and down, like so, and you kind of see me do it in the previous video. And then upward strikes like that as well, with the center of balance right here, you would be able to maintain control of this insanely heavy sword. Even if, say, you could lift a car pretty easily, but your weight is around the same area, 100, but honestly with like super strength, you would expect some level of increased density, so maybe they weigh 150 kilos. That's not going to matter if the sword still weighs 100 kilos compared to your 150. The momentum is so great, it's going to pull you with it, right? But by doing upward strikes and changing the combat style as a response to the type of weapon you're using, which just makes logical sense, you always have a fighting style that is constructed around the weapon you're using to get all the advantages you can out of it. Well, then absolutely you can fight with a heavy weapon, counterbalance stuff like that, that is over 50 to 2/3 even your full body weight, and still maintain a measure of control if the weapon is designed right. Counterbalanced. What about clubs and maces? Because again, this is kind of a classic weapon that people generally ascribe to people with super strength. There is a measure of logic to it only if a certain circumstance isn't fulfilled. And it does kind of go into another question that I feel deserves to be explored far more. And it's the idea of the material that the weapons are made out of. Now, I mentioned in my previous video, if you have a sword that weighs up to 100 kilos, you can't have it made out of steel. Steel will not be able to support its own weight. I mean, you do one big strike, smack it into the ground, it's going to wreck itself. The handle will bend like the blade, because there's the thing, square cube law, not our friend in this circumstance. Whenever you increase something's weight, like if you double it, you're doubling its size, but its weight is increasing by a factor of 8. So its weight is going far faster than its own structural strength. And there's a point where the weight will actually surpass its own ability to support itself structurally, and we run into problems. And I just kind of say offhand, well, you just need to use some type of fantasy material. And in fantasy and comic books, there's materials like that everywhere. You know, adamantium or mithril or adamantine, you know, that's a different fantasy variant. And then there's Valyrian steel. So yeah, fantasy materials, they're quite common. Okay, what if we were to take out that easy kind of hand wave problem in the plot? Because, you know, it's like, oh, it won't be able to support, it's a magical material, okay? What if we had to use real earth materials? And this is actually a very intriguing question, because honestly, I think this would change the type of weapons that we would want to use. Now, I reckon a sword that weighs 10 kilos, that's fine, not a problem at all. You could have even up to 20, 50 kilos, maybe. I think Michael Cthulhu, the guy who makes these giant swords, champion of a guy, has shown that even swords of pretty insane weight can actually still hit things and hold themselves together quite nicely. When we get up to the 100 kilo mark, that's where I say, okay, we're running into problems. But yeah, especially the standard 10 kilo mark, which is what I kind of suggest, steel is perfectly fine. You won't run into an issue. All right, so now 100 kilo range. Okay, well in that case, I actually don't think a sword would be able to hold itself together with steel. But if you wanted a weapon that weighed like 100 kilos, because your character has so much strength, like you have that strength in the fantasy setting or whatever, and you have the armor to anchor yourself, you can do all of those things. A sword, no, it's too thin. Okay, this is the problem with swords, okay? For swords to work well, you do want the blade to be thinner. And there comes a point where to have the sword to support its own weight, you'll need to thicken the blade so much where it's not really a sword, it's just a massive club with an edge. Okay, it's kind of a sword, a clubby sword. All right, I can grant it. What about the handle? The handle would have to be probably pretty big round and maybe even like that. So your character might need huge Hulk kind of hands, and the Hulk does have hands like that. So that means, yeah, really big round handles so they wouldn't bend at the grip. Okay, maybe you could get away with a sword like that. But then there is the other thing, like, do you need a sword? Well, focusing any type of force, especially the insane force we have on an edge like that, is pretty strong, but how long will that edge be able to hold with the forces at play? If you strike steel on steel with a sword like this, with so much weight behind it, the edge is going to get wrecked. Swords are really good at holding their edge against things like flesh, okay? And, you know, when a sword strikes against another standard sword, normal size sword strikes against another normal size sword, they will, you know, nick each other, but if they're both made really well, you'll be quite surprised how well they can hold their edges. They're not invincible, but they can hold their edges quite well in those strikes because sword blades don't have a lot of mass behind them, so they're not getting actually clanged together with insane power. But if you increase the weight of the weapon, all right, so there's huge amounts of forces in the blade, and remember, just going back to that thing about blades having very low mass, traditional swords having low mass in the blade, that's not a problem because the edge is so fine that all that force is still concentrated and coming against things easy to actually cut through, you're still good. Okay, ramping up the weight of a blade, increasing the force, the edge isn't going to be a whole spit, okay? Especially if you're trying to hit metal. So if you want to try and hit a tank, right, with this big hulking, you know, huge-handed sword with a blade kind of geometry edge like this, okay? You hit it, the actual fineness of that edge is going to get so messed up and dinted. Well, I'm not saying the whole sword will get dinted. This part of the edge, like right on the edge, will get messed up heaps to the point where it'll be kind of this mangled, blunted mess. And you basically turn yourself into a club anyway. And so if that's going to happen, if you're not going to be able to hold an edge with a sword, what's the point? Well, this is the thing. Having an edge on any really heavy object still focuses that force on a smaller area, which is still beneficial. Even if the edge is rounded like this, okay? Here's a picture, rounded, okay? Instead of being fine and acute to a razor, it is still focusing it in on a certain level. And so I'm really comparing this to clubs, by the way. Would a sword with a rounded, blunted edge that's still really big be better than just a huge club? Yes, in my opinion, because it focuses the force onto a smaller area. Club disperses it more. You might want that though, okay? You might want to do as much damage over a broader area as possible. Swords are more refined instruments where clubs are just kind of splat damage, right? You know that saying, like, he was a sharpened razor where he was just a hammer, yeah, so like someone, anyway. So that analysis kind of plays into effect here, where if you just want a club to do broad damage and, you know, if you want to hit, so you have this giant club with, and you're, you know, this super strong character and you want to crush a tank and hitting it with this club to do a big wide dint and stuff like that, okay, because again, a sword, even with a rounded tip, you hit a tank, the strike has greater chance of penetrating deeper, or bending, the tank will bend down deeper from the strike, but it won't do broad kind of wider damage as a huge club would. So those are the pros and cons. In my opinion, I still think sword, yes, because greater penetration, all right? Greater ability to do more damage in that regard. Even if it doesn't really have an edge, okay? It's like a club slash, it's a clubby sword. That's the name. Clubby sword. And then comparing a giant 100-kilo club to a giant 100-kilo sword, and the sword, like I said, won't be able to hold its edge, right? I think their ability to maintain their own structural integrity, right, under huge weights and force and stuff like that would be okay if you're in the 100-kilo range, but you're gonna get to a point, you know, if increasing the size, increasing the weight of this material where it just won't be able to do it, right? And you strike something and it'll just bend. So still 100 kilos is good enough, right? Gosh. But if we go to someone who can, say, bench press 100 ton with ease, like really insane super strength and the forces they could produce, when they hit something, one of these things are going to break, because honestly, if you can punch with, or if you can produce such pressure, because again, punches, strength, not as much of a transferable thing as I mentioned before, right? If you can produce such pressure like 100 kilos, your durability would have to be insane. In actual fact, your own physical durability would be much greater than steel, and you'd be able to hold yourself together, you know, on these impacts greater than your own weapon would, because again, 100-ton kind of bench pressing capacity using a weapon, and you hit with all your force, say weapon against tank, something is going to break, okay? It's either the weapon or the tank, or both. Most likely it'll be both. The weapon will get bent, mangled, and the tank will get bent, mangled, and then you have two mangled things. And so perhaps one of the other answers about best weapons for super strength when you get to the insanely high weapons isn't that they're not useful, it's that no weapon would actually be able to survive its use. Like Superman using a weapon, and with the amount of force that he could throw behind them, well, the weapon is going to break, unless it's a enchanted, super magical kind of material weapon, as is kind of used before. Actually, I have that comic. Hold on. Seriously, Justice League versus the Avengers. How can you say no, right? Superman using Captain America's shield and Thor's hammer. So, yeah, those are weapons Superman can use. They're indestructible, and he has used them in the past to great effect. I mean, especially taking on a universe-destroying entity. This one, it's a good comic book. So interesting final conclusion there. When we get to the higher kind of tiers of super strength that have been in comic books and stuff like that, perhaps they don't use weapons simply because there's no weapon strong enough to survive their usage with such forces in play, unless they're as strong as they're magical kind of super weapons and stuff. So I really wanted to make this kind of second part follow up, or just, you know, additional one. You can watch this one, then the next one, however you want, on the best weapons for super strength, because as we just found out right now, there's a lot of complexity to it. There's fun ins and outs, and unfortunately I wasn't able to think of it all, cover it all in the previous video. So now I just had to add these things on. It's a great discussion. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course hope to see you again. So until then, farewell.